Welcome to this installment of Witness to Yesterday, the podcast of the Champlain Society. My name is J.D.M. Stewart. Some children's television shows have an indelible space in our minds. Mr. Dress-Up, The Littlest Hobo, The Uncle Bobby Show, to rhyme off a few. Each of these names conjures a vivid trip down memory lane for anyone recalling some of their childhood television memories. And that is just the tip of the iceberg when considering the rich history of kids' television in Toronto. Our guest today has taken a deep dive into this subject. Ed Conroy is the author of the 2025 book, ImagiNation, The Golden Age of Toronto Kids Television, published by Dundurn Press. Ed's book takes us on a nostalgia-filled channel surf of children's TV, ranging from Uncle Chichimus in 1953 to that adorable green puppet who starred in Nanaland in 1999. Ed Conroy is a cultural historian, writer, producer, archivist, and vintage TV sleuth. He is the founder of RetroOntario.com, which strives to collect, convert, research, and exhibit television materials from Ontario's past. Ed's writing has appeared in the Toronto Star, Toronto Life, and blogTO, and among his many media appearances, he has been a guest on CTV, CBC TVO, and Global. In this interview, we are about to discuss some of the shows that shaped the childhoods of many of you listening today. So look up, way up, curl up in the big chair, and get ready to listen to my interview with Ed Conroy. Ed, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, James.
I found your book to be quite fascinating and a bit of a warm hug from the childhood days, but I wanted to start off by talking to you about how you even pulled together the documentation that was necessary to have a book like this, because in your intro, you talk about the dearth of documented television history in Toronto and in even Canada. So how did you pull this together?
Well, it was a lot of research. With any book, obviously, you start with an idea of roughly where you want to go. And I've been blessed over the years with running Retro Ontario has afforded me the opportunity to meet a lot of people who worked in the television field and who worked on children's television. So I was able to interview them. I was able to get access to a lot of materials that aren't, let's say, in the public domain. Even then, I think I even say in the front, some of this stuff, series that are 60, 70 years old, there just isn't anything out there. There's maybe a log line in an old TV guide. So did the best that I could. There was a lot of conflicting information, but I always went with sort of what the majority of research illustrated.
And you have, from what I understand, a collection of VHS tapes that you've picked up over the years. And how many do you actually have?
Well, I mean, it's not just VHS. We have Betamax. You might remember the competing format of VHS. Well, it all started, many years ago. I was taken aback, let's say, with that format. You know, my parents got a VCR when I was very young. And I loved the idea that you could time shift. So you could, if you were out one night, you could still record Magnum PI. You know, you weren't out of luck. So I already had quite a large collection of tapes. And then when I started to research the history of Canadian television and realized that there was all kinds of things, not just television shows, but television commercials and station identification and sign-offs and all the stuff that peppered our television experiences back in the day. All of this stuff was basically lost or inaccessible. And here it was on people's home recorded tapes, because back then, if you went out on a Friday night and the Leafs were playing, you just stuck a tape in the VCR and hit record and you left it going. And then flash forward, 40 years later, the actual hockey game, maybe not that interesting, but certainly all the stuff, the commercials, the station stuff around it was fascinating to me. And so I ended up starting to digitize this material, and people always said, what are you going to do with all this? It was probably borderline, I guess, hoarding at the time in the early 2000s. And then thankfully, this exciting new platform called YouTube came along in 2005. And I thought, oh, this is a good opportunity to kind of share some of this stuff with the world. And what ended up happening was it not only confirmed to me that people are interested in this, there was a lot of apathy about it at the time, but it also then afforded me an opportunity to learn, because on YouTube, you have these comments sections underneath the uploaded video. So there was all kinds of people, not just viewers that had their memories, but people that worked on the production side, or, family members of people that worked on the shows would leave anecdotes. So it became this ongoing oral history for everything, for shows, movies, music. And I've never looked back, as the years have gone on. I guess that was 21 years ago. Wow. People donate tapes to us. We find tapes still at yard sales and thrift stores and such. And people always ask me, well, when are you going to say enough is enough? You've reached the end of the quest. And my response to that is there is no end, because there's an infinite amount of content that is out there that is still lost. So that's what keeps me going.
So if anyone has any VHS or Betamax tapes with read-along on them, send them to Retro Ontario. I was fascinated about the oral history piece, how you were able to add to your historical collection of tapes by people commenting on the YouTube thing. That was quite fascinating. So in your book, you are upfront about saying you're focusing on Toronto's television history. And I was wondering how you made that decision. So in the end, so you weren't including shows like Romper Room, which came out of Kitchener, or Harriet's Magic Hats out of Edmonton. How did you decide just to focus on Toronto in this book?
Certainly. I mean, the most obvious answer to that is I grew up in Toronto, and Toronto was where I've always been, and I've been in the industry, and that already was incredibly overwhelming amount of shows that were made in Toronto. It's kind of like if you were writing a book about, let's say, American films, you might say Los Angeles is kind of the hub. And certainly there was great films that were made in other parts of California. Series like Romper Room, out of Kitchener, as you mentioned, Harriet's Magic Hats, or Danger Bay was Vancouver. These were all equally beloved series, but I felt to try and capture all of that would be a little bit of a disservice, because this is a subject that hasn't really been explored. I mean, that was one of the reasons I even got involved in this, was I couldn't believe there weren't more books, or even a single book looking at this. So I figured, well, we could start with Toronto and see what the response is to that. And then we can, me or hopefully somebody maybe from one of those other regions would see the value in talking about those programs as they related to the geography. So I think if you were talking about Vancouver, I mean, Beachcombers and Danger Bay and all this, very much coming out of the environment, just like something like today's special is very much a reflection, let's say, of Toronto in the early 80s.
So there were a number of names that come up repeatedly in your book, but the one that struck me the most was a gentleman by the name of Fred Rainsbury, and he had a huge role in children's television. I'm wondering, what could you tell us about his contribution, his legacy in terms of kids' television?
So Fred Rainsbury, I mean, he's literally the godfather of Canadian children's television. You might even say children's television, period. The effect that he had was so profound that it still kind of shocks me that he isn't, on the $100 bill, or there isn't a stamp collection of Fred Rainsbury. He probably, because it was the medium of television, which is a very disrespected medium, unfortunately. It always has been. It doesn't seem to change. But Fred Rainsbury was a school teacher, and he was from Enniskillen, so small town, Ontario. And he actually wrote some of the first articles about the effects of television. Because, you weren't there, I wasn't there, but I think a lot of people don't realize when television came out, when it started to become an important medium, I mean, it didn't come to Canada till 1952, but it was, it was happening in America. It was happening in Britain. There was a huge contingent of people that thought this was the end times, right? Similar to how now you see a lot of people, there's visceral reaction to, say, AI and how AI is going to create all these issues. I think with television, it was probably even more intense. And there weren't a lot of people writing about television as a positive force. It was a lot of negativity. So this school teacher, Fred Rainsbury, is writing articles saying, look, it doesn't need to be this way, right? Like, I think a lot of the concerns were that television was going to corrupt the minds of children and turn them into just kind of violent consumers because everything was a commercial, right? Everything was aimed at selling sugary cereals and toys to kids. And he was saying, no, look, if you feel strongly, you should watch television with your children and you can talk about it with them. And it was a very measured, mature response. And this got the attention of the CBC. And so, I've tried over the years to piece it together, how it actually all unfolded. But at some point around 1953, so television had already been going in Canada for about a year, the brass of the CBC understood, okay, we don't really have a coherent vision for children's. Everybody was focused on the grown-up material. So the most prestigious drama or the live concerts or the sports. Children's television was just sort of, throw spaghetti at the wall and whatever sticks. Well, that's where we'll go. But they were following this guy, Rainsbury, getting into arguments, letters to the editor and such in the newspapers. And they called him in and they sort of said, look, if we gave you full reign and said, what would you do with the children's department? Where would you take it? And he obviously made a huge impression, and he was given the keys to the kingdom. And one of the first things that he did was he was handed an American show called The Howdy Doody Show. I don't know if that rings a bell.
Yeah, sure it does.
So Howdy Doody, maybe for younger people, the character Woody from Toy Story movies. Woody was basically Howdy Doody. He was a cowboy, and Howdy Doody Show was a bunch of puppets and a bunch of grown-ups dressed up as different characters, but it was very rooted in American Western frontier imagery. And they would show cowboy movies, and they would have shootouts, and they would sell toys. So Rainsbury naturally was horrified with this program because it embodied everything that was wrong, let's say, with children's television. It was antisocial. It was violent. They would bring these kids. The American Howdy Doody was filmed in New York City, and they would bring a studio audience, live studio audience of like 100 kids every day. And they'd be screaming and throwing popcorn at each other. And, just the louder, the better, the more obnoxious, the better. And they were called the Peanut Gallery. It's an expression a lot of people use. They don't know came out of Howdy Doody. And so CBC had bought the rights to Howdy Doody. They wanted to do a Canadian version of it using the Howdy Doody puppet and some of the other characters. So Fred Rainsbury shows up, and that's the first, day one. That's the first thing he's told he's got to do. And he manages to actually make something a little bit positive out of it. He gets rid of all the violent cowboy stuff, which doesn't really mean anything to Canadians because we weren't born out of that. And he replaces it with this idea of explorers and voyageurs, and starts to show a lot of films showing the Canadian landscape and a lot of Indigenous history. And they introduce some Indigenous characters. And I mean, stuff that really nobody did till much, much, much later. He's doing this in 1954. But at the end of the day, he still sees it as this is an American thing. We need to plant our own flag, and we need to make something that better represents the Rainsbury vision. And so he hires this guy named Bob Hummey. Bob Hummey was an American, ironically, who wasn't getting much traction with a character that he'd created out of Wisconsin. It was airing on the Wisconsin University television station, and it was called The Friendly Giant.
I've heard of it.
And Rainsbury, yeah, you might have heard of it. Rainsbury immediately saw value in Bob Hummey and Bob Hummey's vision, which was the anti-Howdy Doody, right? Whereas Howdy Doody was loud and yelling in a room full of hundreds of kids, Friendly Giant was looking to the camera and talking as if there was one person watching his show, and that was you. It was the kid that was watching at the other end. And it was very soft and very conversational. So it was him and another puppeteer who operated these two other characters. And it was almost like a podcast. I mean, they had a rough idea of what they'd talk about. There wasn't a script, and they just kind of riffed on it. And so Fred Rainsbury immediately said, look, you got to come to Toronto. We'll give you everything you need, but I want you to do it on a bigger scale. And so, 1958, Friendly Giant premieres and essentially lays down the track that all of these other shows follow, which is that idea that you don't need to patronize to children. You don't need to speak down to them. You can look in the camera and talk to them like you're talking to a friend. And wow, what a crazy idea. It actually worked. Yeah. It actually managed to hold young people's attentions, and the rest is history.
And so this seems to be one of the hallmarks of children's television in Canada, this idea that it's not going to be didactic and focusing on rote memorization or rote learning, but it's going to try to engage the imagination and the creativity of children. Does that arc play its way out over the ensuing decades after Friendly Giant?
It absolutely does. I mean, it is always the history of children's television in any country is a struggle between the educational side and the commercial side. And the most successful shows, the ones that we all remember, are the ones that got that balance correct. Some of them were too educational for their own good, maybe too esoteric, too out there, whereas the majority of them, and continue to be, kind of vulgar commercial endeavors.
Yeah.
Strictly driven by selling merchandise or selling T-shirts. And I think Rainsbury, because he was an educator, he brought that to the table without being overtly educational to the point that it's putting the viewers to sleep. Because a lot of the early educational children's shows were essentially a camera locked on a teacher writing on a chalkboard. So they weren't making use of the medium. They were just saying, oh, let's have somebody talk about science. And obviously that's not going to be super effective. But when you introduce an element of imagination or of creativity and make-believe, and you're still able to deliver the educational message, well, then you got a winner. And Rainsbury left the CBC in the mid-'60s, but his vision was, I would say, taken to the next level by the people at TVOntario, because TVOntario came out of the Ontario Educational Communications Authority, which was basically the provincial government of Ontario working with teachers and saying, how can we integrate curriculum into programs that kids are actually going to care about? And they understood that it had to be entertaining. At the end of the day, it's a total waste of everybody's time if it's boring. If it puts the kid to sleep, well, why are we even doing this?
Well, I was interested in how closely the link was between children's television and educators, and even a show like Polka Dot Door, where I think it was a school principal who was one of the co-founders of the show. Am I right about that, Ed? Vera Good?
Vera Good, yes. I mean, Polka Dot Door is got a very interesting nexus of creators who all came together. And it was another program where it was based on another country's flagship kid show. It was based on a BBC program called Play School. And that had been created because at the time in the mid-'60s in Great Britain, there was a shortage of preschools. And so kids were stuck at home. So someone at the BBC said, well, why don't we just make a 2-hour show that's basically, reading stories and having a nap and doing a drawing. And, they had the stuffed animals and instead of look through the polka dot door, they looked out through the window and they got the educational piece. But they bought it and they looked at it, and Vera Good and Coney Bear, who was the producer, they understood that it needed more. It needed a Canadian element that wasn't there. And so they came up with this bizarre creature who everybody knows called the
not Pokeroo.
Yeah. The Pokeroo. I mean, he's the closest thing I think we have in Canada to a big bird, right? I mean,
right.
That program has been off the air since the early 1990s, but Pokeroo still goes, 2026. You'll see him out at events, and everybody, even they might not know where he came from, but kids know who it is, which is great.
Yeah, he's a legend. So let's talk about some of these imaginary characters, the puppets, if we will. They're some of the more famous people, Casey and Finnegan from Mr. Dress Up, Rusty and Jerome from Friendly Giant, and of course there's others. And I thought it might be interesting to talk about some of the puppeteers, because behind all of these iconic and much loved puppets are humans doing the puppeteering. So who were some of the legendary figures in Canadian puppeteering?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things Bob Hummey felt very strongly about when he came up with the whole concept of Friendly Giant was he was looking at Howdy Doody, and he was looking at these other American shows that used puppets, but nobody had really used the puppet as the entry level for the viewer. So let's treat the character of the puppet as if they're the child, like they're the 6-year-old watching. And so that was the idea behind Rusty, right? Was that he was the stand-in for instead of having a kid there, you had Rusty.
Right.
He's asking those questions that the 6-year-old would ask. When he came to Toronto, the fellow whose name escapes me, who was doing it in Wisconsin, he didn't want to leave his home. He wanted to stay in Wisconsin. So they had to recast the puppeteer. And Bob Hummey interviewed everybody. And they even had another guy that tried to do it and was a total disaster. And then he meets this fellow, Rod Coney Bear. And Rod Coney Bear was a radio guy. So he wasn't super familiar with television, but they had that chemistry, right? It's like this chemistry that you can't really explain what it is. You can't really write it down. But when it's there, it's there. You don't need a script. You can just riff off of each other. All the great, when you think about it, comedy duos, or even musically, Lennon and McCartney, right? You just have that back and forth. So Rod Coney Bear was kind of the first in 58, obviously.
And is it true, by the way, that he played Rusty and Jerome the Giraffe? Was
Yes.
he both characters?
He was both. Which
is pretty remarkable when you see footage of the old shows
interplay.
And they're going back and forth and their voices are different. It's an amazing feat of acting by Rod Coney Bear. It's something else.
It's absolutely amazing. And I invite your listeners to go look at those clips on YouTube because, there's no editing, right? I mean, it was a 15-minute daily program with a locked camera and no script. They had a rough idea. So, today's episode, we're going to talk about what it's like to go get your hair cut. And they would just riff on that and tell funny stories. And it was very warm and endearing. And so, yes, you mentioned Dress Up. Obviously, you have Judith Lawrence, who did Casey and Finnegan and gave the personalities that you see even in a character like Finnegan, who doesn't talk. He's a dog, but he still had that sense of character.
Yes.
Now, the real royalty, I would say, if we're talking about puppeteers, because you're right, like it is remarkable how adept you have to be as a puppeteer to hold an audience's attention, to interplay with other puppets, interplay with human hosts, and still be beloved. I would say the most important two in the early days, you had John Conway, who was, you mentioned him in the intro, Uncle Chichimus. And he was the very first character, the very first thing that you saw when CBC went on the air in 1952. They showed the CBC logo and said, "Welcome to the wonderful world of television." They actually had the logo was reversed. It was a technical snafu. And then they cut away and you see this, weird looking puppet. And that was this fellow, John Conway, who was also a teacher, an educator, and very, very knowledgeable about literature. So he was coming out of the world of Shakespeare and Francis Bacon, and he was an incredibly intelligent man, but he felt very strongly that these characters that some people might see as just goofy kids show characters, they had depth to them. And so he's the OG. I mean, he's the original.
Yeah.
Later on, you had the Keogh family. So that started with one day Fred Rainsbury was walking around downtown Toronto, and he went into the Simpsons department store, and he saw all these beautiful puppets, and he asked who made these, and they said, oh, it's a show, and it's this lady, and she's this eccentric old lady. And he left his business card. He said, please tell her to call me, because he was looking for puppets for a religious program that they were starting to develop. And so he hired this lady, and she was just so sort of batty and zany that he couldn't corral her. So her son came in and basically took over what she was doing.
Was it John Keogh?
Yes. So John Keogh takes over, and Fred Rainsbury has a great quote. He said, John showed up and cleaned up his mom's mess, and then he basically never left. He became the in-house puppet guru for the CBC, and he and his wife did everything. And then eventually their daughter, Nina, she took over. They were doing some of the additional puppetry on Friendly Giant. So there was a bunch of characters called the Jazz Cats. You might remember them.
Mm-hmm.
They would come in and play when the live music was happening. And so Nina took over doing the Jazz Cats. And then, Nina then becomes, I would say, the godmother of Canadian children's television, because she works on Dress Up. She works on Friendly. She worked on Sesame Street. She worked, literally every major Canadian kids show had a role for Nina somewhere, somehow.
Yeah.
So yes, that family kind of raised the bar as high as it could go. I think John Keogh's probably the most important character he created that gets a little bit lost in the shuffle was he did Howard the Turtle, who was one of the hosts of a program called Razzle Dazzle.
Right.
And Razzle Dazzle was the daily show, had all kinds of innovation going on. It was a massive sensation. But whereas Uncle Chichimus was a definable character and he had a lot of quirks, Howard the Turtle, according to viewers and according to other people that worked on these shows, Howard the Turtle was the first puppet that actually could make you cry.
And what year was that show? What year did Razzle Dazzle come out?
Razzle Dazzle was 1961.
Okay.
So it was the very early days still.
Yeah.
And Razzle Dazzle came about because they were looking at these viewing habits of young people, and they identified, this is still a problem to this day, that kids were coming home from school and they were watching repeats on the American channels. So they're watching like Gunsmoke and Have Gun Will Travel. And at the time, those would have been the shows that were on after school. And they wanted to develop something that was different. So they kind of took the Howdy Doody live studio audience and human hosts with puppets, but they turned it on its head, because up until that point, hosts had always been older men.
Yeah.
Like always. No matter what genre it was always older men. And they cast a young teenage girl named Michelle Finney to be the host. And when the Beatles came and played Maple Leaf Gardens in 1964, they were greeted by Michelle Finney. Like, she was kind of the face of young Canada.
Wow.
So yeah, it was a wild program, but yes, John Keogh and Howard the Turtle deserves an incredible amount of respect just because he elevated the art of puppetry with that character.
So let's move from puppets to completely human casts, and one of the more famous shows in its many iterations, Degrassi. And I was wondering if you could just give us a succinct tracing of that show, which you say is a cultural Polaroid of early 1980s Toronto, and there exists no equal in any medium. Tell us a little bit about Degrassi.
So once again, we have something coming from an educator. The creator of Degrassi was a school teacher from Etobicoke, Linda Schuyler. And she was teaching media, which now is something you can go and get a degree in media. But in the 1970s, it was very difficult to even find books, textbooks to use to teach kids how to understand media and how do you construct a film and all of these things. So Linda wanted to teach a class about this, and her friend was a librarian at Earl Hague Public School, and they ordered a book called Ida Makes a Movie because it sounded like something that would be useful. It ended up being a young children's book about a cat called Ida who makes a movie. And they realized, well, this isn't going to work. We can't teach teenagers using this preschool book. So they adapted it into a short film called Ida Makes a Movie, but they used real kids instead of actors, and they shot it like it was a documentary. So it was cinema verite. And it went on to become a sensation. It won all kinds of awards. And so they started to produce, let's say, maybe 2 or 3 a year, these short films that had a rotating cast of characters that all lived on a street called Degrassi Street. And these were very low stakes stories, okay? They were somebody got invited to a sleepover and they were too scared, and how do they tell their friends they're too scared to go sleep over at their house, okay? It wasn't someone's going to blow up the school and we got to stop them, okay? Like the later iterations of Degrassi got a little bit intense. But the reason I think, obviously, that program was massively important is it was the idea of treating it like it was a documentary. So you aren't shooting it to look good, right? They treated it like it was Leslieville in 1979, all right? They were using 16 millimeter film, shooting it on handheld so that kids are walking down the street, the camera's guys walking with them. A lot of this stuff now, younger people would say, well, so what? I mean, everything looks like that now. But back then, nothing looked like that. If you hired actors to be kids in a TV show, they all had a certain look, all right? They all had agents. They all dressed the same. Degrassi was the first show that had kids that were overweight, that had bad skin, that spoke with accents that represented the changing demographics of Toronto in the 70s. And so you try to imagine when this program was being shown in England or in the Deep South, because it was widely syndicated. And audiences loved it because it was totally authentic. All right. There was nothing in it that felt fake. And as it evolved, it then became a show called The Kids of Degrassi Street. And then that evolved into Degrassi Junior High. And then there was Degrassi High. And obviously they age up these characters.
Which was the one that Drake appeared in?
So he doesn't come along until it's the Degrassi, The Next Generation. And that was 2001. But it's funny because if you say to somebody now, oh, old Degrassi, that's the one they think you're talking about.
Right.
The Drake one. And no, before that, there was this whole other universe of Degrassi.
Old Degrassi, the OG.
The old Degrassi. But I think that in terms of genre television, there is not a single Canadian series that was more traveled around the world and more loved around the world. And I think, again, because young people watched it and they saw a reflection, even if they spoke different, they didn't understand, there was no subtitles, they saw themselves, right? And that was what, again, somebody like Linda Schuyler, an educator, brought to this genre, but also understood you're going to teach emotional growth and all of these important things, but not in a heavy-handed way.
I want to ask you, before we wrap up, about a show that exposes the significant gap between television critics and the audience. And I'm thinking of The Littlest Hobo, which I think it was Jim Bodden. I can't remember if he's the one who said this is a terrible show. And then it drew 1.5 million viewers. So what was the secret to success for The Littlest Hobo, which I think still has a bit of a cult following on YouTube, perhaps, with old clips of it?
Oh, yeah, no. I mean, Hobo's huge. He shows up in like Trailer Park Boys and, he's Canadiana, I would say.
Right.
I think, look, if you're really looking at it from a critical lens, it's a pretty poorly made show. It was incredibly cheap. It was shot on videotape, not film. So it has that kind of cheap look. You see the dog jumping out of an airplane with a parachute and all this goofy stuff. Why that show still resonates? Very simple. The theme song.
Right.
It is an absolutely remarkable piece of music. I think it's probably the best known folk song that has come out of Canada, and we put out a lot of good folk songs.
Who wrote it? Do you remember who wrote it, Ed?
Well, it was Terry Bush performed it. And Terry Bush, you got to understand, was a jingle guy. Like he did Canada Dry Ginger Ale, and he did I Adore My Commodore 64, and he came out of the commercial world. And he understood that you got to capture that moment. And it's funny because originally the producers of Littlest Hobo hated that song. And they were using like a jazz song. And finally somebody came to their senses and said, look, stick this piece of music in. And that's my honest opinion is it's all about that theme song.
I think you say in your book that the problem with the golden age, as they say, is that you never know when you're living in one. And I think after reading your book, we know that people of our age who grew up with television between the 50s, 60s, up to the 21st century, we were living in a golden age. And it's been great to talk to you about these shows, Ed.
Oh, thank you so much, James. It's always fun to walk down memory lane.
I wish we could do more of it, but pick up the book if people want to read more about these old shows. My guest today has been Ed Conroy, author of ImagiNation, The Golden Age of Toronto Kids Television, published in 2025 by Dundurn Press. You've been listening to Witness to Yesterday, the podcast of the Champlain Society. If you like what you've heard today, please forward the link for today's program to your friends and others who might be interested to hear it. Consider hitting the like button as well on whatever platform you heard us today. The goal of the Witness to Yesterday podcast is to bring attention to the wonderful works of history that are published in this country on a regular basis. To find out more about the Champlain Society, please visit our website at champlainsociety.ca. To reach me or any of our hosts at Witness to Yesterday, drop us a line at info@champlainsociety.ca. We'd love to hear from you. This podcast is made possible by the members of the Champlain Society who work hard to bring to life original documents in Canadian history. We also want to thank a consortium of Canadian scholarly publishers for their financial support. That includes the University of Toronto Press, UBC Press, and McGill Queen's University Press. We are also grateful to the support of the UTP Journal team. My name is J.D.M. Stewart. Today's episode was recorded on April 20th, 2026, and produced by Kevin Ball.